This is the second part of episode 17 called The Theater of Life in Naples. And on this side of the episode, I'm calling it the Theater of Death, because I'm going to take you inside the 2,300-year-old Ipogeo Cristallini. It's a mausoleum that was discovered in the late 1800s below a palazzo, but it has only been open to the public since 2022. And I've been trying to go ever since it opened, but the hours have been very limited and the timing just never really worked out. But a few weeks ago, finally, on March 19th, which is the Feast of St. Joseph and also Father's Day in Italy, I finally had the opportunity. So if you haven't already listened to the first part of this episode, there you'll meet Ines and Vincenzo, the owners of Atelier Ines, which is a beautiful art boutique hotel. It's right next to the entrance of Ipogeo Cristallini. And the wine cantina, the wine cellar inside their hotel, is directly above it. And at the end of my visit with them, Ines walked me over to the entrance of the Ipogeo and introduced me to the people who would be leading the tour. Only 10 people at a time are allowed to go inside. And also I should note, the hours are now much more standardized. There's also an audio guide. You can go in with a private group, or you can do the standard visit with one of the guides who works at the site. We checked our bags into lockers because when you descend further below ground, you are in some narrow spaces, so they want to make sure that you won't turn around and accidentally damage something. And then we were given flashlights, which is so cool because it really creates what I call an Indiana Jones experience. And I firmly believe that every Italy itinerary should include at least one Indiana Jones experience. If you're me, 2, 3, 4 at minimum. And then before descending, we were invited to watch a presentation that includes reconstructions of what the Ipogeo would have looked like 2,300 years ago. "2,300 years ago, Napoli, Neapolis, was a Greek city, and it was all built on a hill. It's the neighborhood that today is referred to as the Centro Storico, and it's one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities on Earth. It's where you'll find the famous Veiled Christ, the Sorbillo Pizzeria. It's also where you'll find the Naples Underground tour. Now, the Sanità district, where Ipogeo Cristallini is found, was just beyond the walled gates of the Greek city. It's in the area where then people would bury their dead in the much more sanitary area beyond the urban grid. The stone on which Naples itself is built is very unique. It's called tufa, and it's a mix of volcanic debris because Naples sits between several volcanoes, and then sea sediment, which is deposited and then compacted over millennia. So the very first Greek colonists carved cisterns into the tufa, and they are still there below the city. And the Ipogeo is also carved out of the tufa, so it wasn't a process of building onto the stone, but rather excavating it. Now, we can assume that the Greek families who built the mausoleum, the Ipogeo, they must have been wealthy and maybe even part of an important political class. And we can assume that there were dozens of similar mausoleums in the district. When I saw the reconstruction of the exterior of the mausoleum in the video presentation, 2,300 years collapsed in front of me because it looked exactly like the mausoleum that my family has in Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. And when my father died in 2021, I inherited the key as one of the last caretakers of this mausoleum. And I think at this point, I'm one of the only people still alive who knows the stories of everyone who is buried there.
The entire experience felt like a creative city of the dead. All of the cemetery felt like it was filled with vibrant people, even though they were dead. It seemed like every stone had some kind of a story on it or some sort of image.
The voice you're hearing is my good friend Rita J. King, who you may remember from episode 4, Vittoria Colonna Had It All. And if you haven't heard that episode, go back and listen because it's a doozy.
It felt very sacred and spiritual and mythological to me, and layers of time just collapsed into that moment. But I also remember you. I remember watching you walk through this space, and you were so alive to me and so vibrant. And I remember thinking how lucky we were to have each other and how special it felt to be the person that went with you in that moment.
4 years ago, I was eager to show my father this new AI tool that was being offered by one of the Ancestry websites. You could take a photograph and then it would lightly animate it to bring the person to life. The head would turn ever so slightly, the eyes would move around, and it was so cool because you could take a picture of somebody you'd never met, an old black and white photograph, and it would bring them to life. So I showed it to my father, who was equally fascinated, and we were on the phone as I was using this tool to animate various family photographs, and then I would email them to him and we would look at them together. I animated my great-grandparents and another photograph of a relative in Italy who never came to the United States, who was a doctor and sent these beautiful, eloquent letters. And then my father asked me to do the picture of his Aunt Betty. Betty was Brigida, who was only 23 years old when she died in 1939, which was almost a decade before my father was even born. But he had grown up always hearing stories about her. She was young, beautiful, full of life, and then she had a routine surgery and died very unexpectedly. And the family was never the same again. My father would hear these stories in particular when her brothers, his father, and uncles had a little bit too much to drink at family gatherings, and then they would start to cry about Brigida. My great-grandmother fell into madness over a long period of time, and Uncle John, who was only 9 months younger than Brigida, tried his best to hold the family together. Brigida's father, my great-grandfather, responded by building a giant mausoleum in Woodlawn Cemetery. And my father grew up going there. It was kind of a happy experience for him. They would go after Sunday Mass, and sometimes his father would let him drive the family car in the lanes of the graveyard. When my father saw the picture of Brigida, he began to cry. And then we started to laugh because he had a great sense of humor about his own intense sentimentality. But I had no idea that that was going to be the last conversation I ever had with my father. After 24 hours of unanswered phone calls, I began searching the junk drawer for the spare key to my father's home, which is also my childhood home, that I never thought I would need to use in this way. My brother arrived shortly after I did, and then we sat with our father, who had died peacefully, napping on the couch, probably the night before. Our childhood home was lit only by the spinning red light of the police car in the driveway while we waited for the coroner to arrive. "We have to sell the house," my brother said without looking at me. And so what came next was an unexpected replay of my childhood, a literal unpacking, uncovering, and unwinding of my parents' lives. All their choices were there to ponder in papers, the safe deposit box, the attic, and no one left to defend their side of the story. Tombs and mausoleums, like the one on Via Cristallini in Naples, are built for memory. But the house at that point was an archive, filled with 1,000 stories to either abandon or interpret, and then we had to assess the value and decide the fate of every single object, from the food still left in the refrigerator to my father's childhood teddy bear. The first sorting was forensic. There was a Pepto-Bismol bottle left open on the kitchen counter. And then I was humbled by the tenderness of my father's grief following my mother's passing exactly 3 years prior, when I noticed how every room had photos of her positioned to look over him like a supernatural security system. When we went through my father's armoire, we pulled out familiar objects. A small box, a matchbox really, but with a porcelain top on it, had a picture of the temples of Pollux and Castor, and then inside was a small key. I vaguely remembered it, but my brother recognized it right away as the key to the family mausoleum. So he took the box, he handed it to me, and he said, "You're the historian in the family. You can take care of our dead relatives." The tour leader invited us to descend the staircase, and the first thing we encountered was the reception area. Yes, the Ipogeo had a room specifically for those who are visiting the dead to gather. And there's a table there, really an altar, with wine vases and then niches in the walls for additional objects that would have been placed there. They could have been decorative things like pomegranates or eggs, which then and now are symbols of rebirth. In total, there were over 700 objects recovered by archaeologists, including urns, votive statues, and they're all stored in the Archaeological Museum in Naples. Fun side note, especially for those people from the New York City area, they call the deposits, the storerooms at the Naples Archaeological Museum, Sing Sing, after the famous prison in Ossining, New York, Sing Sing, because once you go in there, you may never come out. There's a lot of good stuff. Anyway, the walls of the reception area are painted with garlands, and then the ceiling has painted squares to recreate the experience of a mini Greek temple. And then, best of all, there are names in Greek scrawled on the walls. Now, archaeologists have also found many Roman objects, and so what that tells us is that the tombs were reused. And that's going to sound really strange to American listeners and not strange at all to Italian listeners, because Italians continue to recycle the tombs of the dead. Really, bodies are only left in place for a few years, and then the bones are transferred to something smaller to make room for somebody else. The Ipogeo was probably lost to history during the 300s, when there was a massive mudslide from the Capo di Monte hill that covered all of the Sanità district as well as the historic center of the city, which meant that it covered the Greek and Roman cities that you can now see on the Naples Underground tour. And then in the Middle Ages, people just started building directly on top of it. And so Naples is like a giant layer cake, or maybe a tiramisu would be a better analogy. So what you have at the base of Naples is the Greek and the Roman city, then a nice thick layer of mud. Then you've got the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, the modern era all taking place. The Ipogeo was discovered in 1889 when somebody began digging a well. And fortunately, the owners recognized the value of what lay below and they kept it sealed, except for occasional viewings by friends or family. And then much later in the 1980s, which was a time of a lot of drugs and violence in this district, the very, very first activities began to be organized to reclaim the valor of the district, and at that time there were some viewings. The palazzo is in the same family, and it was in 2018 that the couple who now own it began to work with archaeologists and the Italian government to finally find a way to open the Ipogeo to the public.
Your family has a mausoleum, and there was a broom, like a little broom and a chair, and it felt like we were going to a sacred private chapel. I remember that you had a Castor and Pollux case that had a key, and it ended up being that, if my memory is correct, that key didn't get us in there, but it still felt, you thought that was the key, and then the guy that had the map had to help us figure out how to get into your mausoleum.
So it was that guy, Bruce. We followed him on a golf cart. He drove the golf cart to help us locate exactly where the mausoleum was. It was like an oddly funny day because that guy Bruce just totally provided the comic relief. I mean, I remember he was he's like one of these New York mavens. He was full of trivia and was trying to get the key to work. And I remember he like rubbed his nose, like he was like, you need some grease from your skin to try to make the key work. And I was like, just trying not to be like, oh God, that's so gross, but stay polite.
He also was like acting as if he was like a traffic cop, like telling us how to like walk down here, go down here, like that cemetery, he knows it like the back of his hand.
And then he left us there for a while because he had to go get the key, which was like a big giant, Victorian looking key. And then when we went in there, do you remember what you thought?
My memory is that there's a narrow piece of vertical stained glass and then pictures on a little altar with the chair and the broom. Well, the first thing I thought was, and I probably didn't say it at the time because it's your family tomb, but I may have, that I wonder if you sat there as a child. And if you had sat there as a child, did you even conceive of what death was? Because I remember being very, very preoccupied with mortality as a child. And so I just remember thinking, I wonder if tiny Danielle sat there and here she is as an adult in the future. And so I had a temporal experience.
I don't remember really contemplating. I remember going into the mausoleum and it just seemed like big, like a monument to me. And I knew that there were dead people buried in there, but at least I don't remember any like absorbing who was in there. But then when I went in there that time, I just thought, oh my God, poor Brigida is just jammed in this storage closet with her family who terrorized her and that she tried to tried to escape in death. And they were all stacked up. The mausoleum was built for her, and that stained glass window, in fact, has Saint Brigida on it. And she's there, and then right underneath her, if I'm remembering correctly, is her mother, and then there's her father and her uncle Paolo and two of her brothers, and then there's an urn there with another one of her brothers because they ran out of spaces. And I just thought this just feels like a storage shed.
Well, I remember being struck by Brigida. You had told me stories about the reactions people in your family had to her in her lifetime and then after her death. And so it did feel to me like a place to keep Brigida, like, but not just her body. I felt like it was a way to capture a part of her and then everyone could stay with her. I remember feeling that in there.
Yeah. And then I did think about so many of the tombs that I had seen in Pompeii, and they're exactly the same, going back 2,000 years ago. And then also too, if you walk around Naples, especially in the more working class neighborhoods like the Sanità district, but everywhere really in Naples, you will see these little street side shrines with photographs, family photographs, and little devotional statues that accompany them, just exactly as they would have in the Roman world, where they would have a family altar as soon as you entered the house that would honor the ancestors and the various household gods. And I just, yeah, it was a geeky art historian moment of contemplation, of course. Here we are in the Bronx, and this ritual has been replicated.
I was moved by it. I recently saw a photograph of a tomb that someone had constructed that had a statue of a woman and her hand was reaching. And then on the summer solstice, an illuminated heart comes to her hand. And I thought, when did we lose the effort that we used to make? Not that everyone had the luxury of doing that at any point or the creativity to do that, but should that be something that gets more consideration just to memorialize these human beings who lived?
On top of the altar in the Ipogeo's reception area is a hole, and that is the link between the living and the dead, who are buried just below. So down another flight of steps, we went to the most jaw-dropping room in the Ipogeo. There's a photo of it in the show notes, and I had seen many photos of it ahead of time, but let me just say, the experience of being there is very different. The dead are entombed with beds, which are also excavated from the tufa stone. And then along the side of the beds are painted decorations, including more pomegranates. And then, best of all, atop the beds are pillows. Pillows. They're sculpted and painted to look plump and inviting, so it's quite a luxurious tomb. Overseeing the dead is a giant face, a giant head of Medusa. And effectively, it's serving to scare away any evil spirits that might disturb the dead. The Romans wrote at length about Greek painting and how extraordinary it was, but almost none of it survives. Some of the most elaborate mosaics in wealthy homes in Pompeii are thought to be replicas of Greek paintings which no longer exist. Most famously, the Alexander mosaic, which depicts the epic battle between Alexander the Great and Darius of Persia. But the color on the Medusa is well intact, making it one of the single most important historical artifacts in the world. And that's why this experience in person packs such a punch. Here you are, underground, at a place where there's no line, no selfies. You're in a working class neighborhood, and you're just a few feet away from this beautiful object made by a Greek artisan 2,300 years ago. It was commissioned certainly by somebody living, but its function was for the spirit world. And after all of those years of darkness, forgotten, sealed away by a mudslide, with an entirely new city built on top of it, there you are, there I was, getting to see her once again.
Seeing your family's name at the top of the mausoleum reminded me of the church that Michelangelo's mother's family that says Rucellai on the top. Very fancy to have your family name on a mausoleum.
Yeah, I remember they when they pulled up the documents, the original price tag was on there. It was like, was my great grandfather in the mafia? And I didn't know, but I found out later it's just that he made a lot of real estate investments in the Bronx when land there was dirt cheap and did very well, but took probably a very large percentage of the fortune that he made in his lifetime solely to build that mausoleum.
I really like hearing the stories about Brigida. And I just, based on the stories you told me, would not be the least bit surprised if a huge motivation for building that mausoleum was for her and the expense.
It was entirely for her. She's the oldest child. Her father wanted her to be a good Italian daughter and get married and take care of the family. In the role that she kind of had, she was the American born daughter. She was the one who spoke English. So for my grandfather, who was much younger than her, his younger brother, Uncle Pat, she was like a mom. She was like their American mom in a way, who could speak English and go to school and talk to the teacher if needed. And then she apparently was very beautiful, and many guys wanted to marry her, and she had a job. She had a couple of jobs, which was really unusual for her time. And the fact that she was 23 in 1939 from a very traditional Italian family and not married means that she was really defying the wishes of everybody around her. And then she had a deviated septum and always had problems with her nasal passages. And then she had surgery. And the story prior had always been that she died because there was like lead paint or something. I don't know the details, but that's what people would say, like, oh, there was lead paint back in those days in the hospital and she got an infection and she died. But there was a man she was in love with who was Jewish, and he was just as in love with her, and they wanted to get married, and both of their families forbid it. And in an act of fury, her father yelled and screamed and destroyed the house, throwing over the furniture, and she was just so desperate and it felt so beaten down that after the surgery she got sick and like just didn't have the will to live, which is so tragic. Romantic too, it sounds like a movie, but it actually happened.
I think that's a guilt mausoleum in part. It's a temple of love and it's a temple of guilt, it seems like.
This section that Brigida and the rest of the family in is called Bluebell, and there are a lot of Italians in Bluebell, but right around the corner is Miles Davis, Duke Ellington. There are all these jazz musicians, and there are so many famous New Yorkers there. I remember the mausoleum for the Hearst family is there, and it's absolutely gorgeous. I mean, most of these were built during the Art Deco era. So many of the sculptors that made these gravestones were Italian immigrants who were working on major monuments, sculpting beautiful things that are on civic buildings all around the United States. But this was how they made money during down seasons or in between commissions. And then there was like a hill. We were driving past it, and there was just a uniform line of small gravestones. And you looked at it and you said, it's the graveyard of imagination.
I remember some of the stones, like for the musicians, had musical notes on them, which made me hear music in my head when we walked by. And some of those extravagant mausoleums, it's just amazing how you can walk around that cemetery and see who the people were in life. And yeah, I felt like the whole thing with the key was really part of it. That you thought that was the key to get in, but like the key didn't get in, and it felt very It felt very spiritual to go there with you.
And I never did find the key. I went through everything in that house. My brother and I emptied out the house. So we went through literally everything. And I never did find the key. And my dad used to go there regularly to clean the mausoleum, sweep it out. That's why that little broom was there. And I never did find it. So fortunately, they keep it there so I can always get them to open it up for me. I haven't been back since that day. I sort of inherited that mausoleum. I'm kind of the new sweeper of it, but I haven't been back. But after going to see this tomb in Naples a couple of weeks ago, I am really compelled to go back because it was the same exact experience and I was really moved by it. At first, it's hard to visualize at first because it's underneath a palazzo. And you go in and you go through a courtyard and there's like garbage cans there and the recycling bin and a couple of cars parked. And then you go through a door and you go downstairs and you have to wait for them they give you a flashlight and you all go down together. They allow 10 people at a time to go in. But there's a little multimedia presentation first where they've done a reconstruction of what it looks like. And at that point, when on the screen I saw the exterior, which looked exactly like Brigida's mausoleum, sans the last name, it took my breath away and I had to sit down for a moment. I had tears that kind of came to my eyes. I was just sort of overwhelmed. I didn't really know what to think. And the woman who was getting ready to lead the tour, she looked at me and she's like, "Oh, I completely understand. It's very moving. It moves me too." I was moved by how 2,300 years make no difference in this ritual.
Your father is in the mausoleum?
No.
Okay. Is anyone else ever going to be in the mausoleum?
No, it's full. Yeah,
Okay.
a maximum occupancy. In fact, there were six drawers. They're drawers. And then the seventh for Uncle John was his ashes are there in an urn.
Okay.
And you see that in the ancient tombs as well. We'll see actually what they do in Italy today. They have a much more intimate experience of death. And this is where I really, in many ways, when I'm in Italy, I feel very Italian and I find parts of myself that feel very much at home. But this is an experience where I was like, oh, I'm an American. Because you go to the cemetery and everybody has these mausoleums and there are some graves that are sort of in the ground, but they're in stone above ground and they're temporary. So because land is at a premium and Italy has very rocky terrain, you don't get to rest in, eternal peace. There's no eternal rest. Basically, they wait until your body has decomposed and it's just bones. And then they open it up and then they sell the tomb. And then often if there's a family mausoleum, they gather those bones and the dust and they put them in an urn. And then they're all gathered together in a mausoleum similar to what we saw. And it's weird when you walk around an Italian cemetery because you'll see all these open graves. You'll see signs that say this is for sale. I was asking about a location of a tomb in a more modern cemetery, and the family was telling me how like they were going to move grandma, but they unearthed her and they were like, "Oh, she's not non consumato. The body was not yet consumed," and so they had to rebury her and wait another year. So they have their experience of death is far more intimate, and to me, really disturbing. Nothing wrong with it, I guess, but let me not say disturbing, uncomfortable for me. They say you only really die when people stop saying your name. Uncle John named his daughter Brigida after his beloved sister, and then Bridget, the name she always went by, passed away 2 years ago. She told me a lot of family stories, and also of note, Bridget had a long and happy marriage to a man who was Jewish. So I'm passing on their names to you, and also the name of my father, Albin O'Terry. And if you visit the Ipogeo Cristallini, maybe you can use this story to help you feel a little bit closer to the experience of history that I find so easy to transcend, but I know it's not the same for others. And then soon, when the osteoarchaeologists release their findings about the bones found inside Via Cristallini, those names that are scrawled on the walls may have all new stories, new pieces of history that have long been buried that will now come back to life. At this most holy time of year, when Jews, Muslims, and Christians are all celebrating what is in its very essence the absolute miracle of spring. I wish for you a rinascita, a rebirth of whatever it is your heart most wants and needs. Thank you so much for listening.